Well, welcome to another episode of the Auto Buyer's Guide podcast, everybody. Travis and I are here. I hope you have had a lovely New Year's and Chris Mahana Kwanzaa, however you decide to celebrate it's not the summer solstice, no, winter solstice either. That
Honda
was,
Days, Toyotathon,
yeah,
yeah.
the solstice together all the way through. I don't know, what comes in January? What's the next holiday?
I mean, 2025 is where we're at. That's
Yeah,
plenty. Next up, the
hey,
next big one's Valentine's Day. So
that's true. Yeah. So happy Valentine's Day, everybody. And let's dive into it. So today we're going to be talking about the Honda-Nissan merger, the Mach-E outselling the Mustang. We're going to be diving into some reviews and just general stuff. Also, Travis just road tripped our Volvo C40 up to the Pacific Northwest. So after the break, let's just roll into that.
If you're looking for a new or used car to buy, maybe a truck or SUV or all-electric ride, we're the guys to help you decide. Here on the Auto Buyer's Guide.
So Alex, just the other week, I flew down to the Bay Area and picked up our Volvo C40. And let me tell you, that turned into quite an adventure. And you and I talked about this beforehand. This Volvo was not really designed to be the ultimate road trip electric vehicle. So we knew it was going to take some time. But I'll tell you what, I'm not usually a traffic complainer. I spent a lot of time in my life around Seattle. When I was trying to hit the road right around 3:30, I ended up in a 5-hour gridlock situation due to an emergency repair on the highway. And let me tell you, that really slows down progress.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. What was it? A sinkhole? What happened?
They said pothole repair, and as soon as we'd been stopped for, I don't know, 30 minutes, an hour, and the helicopter flew over, I knew I was in trouble. But at
Uh-oh.
that point, everything was blocked. I mean, there wasn't an escape route, and everyone else who knew where to go. Obviously, I'm not familiar with the area. Whatever back way they had was already also going to be backed up. So that really slowed things down. What ended up being was supposed to be a 1 night, 2 day drive event ended up being a 2 night, 3 day drive event. But I'll admit, I went ahead and made it more interesting, worth my time. So instead of heading straight up I-5, I went out to the Oregon coast, spent a little bit of time out there. So
Ooh,
tried to make the most
wow.
of it. But boy, was that an adventure.
Risky in a 200-mile EV. So we should talk about that. So
Yeah.
we have ourselves a 2023 Volvo C40 electric. We'll dive in a moment into Volvo's EV sales. What do we call it? EV sales not rise, not not bump.
EV sales status.
Sales stagnation. It is the winter sales stagnation. But yeah, so we got ourselves a Volvo C40, which on a good day is realistically about 200 miles of range from 100% full to 100% empty.
The car says about 210 when it's full. But obviously, highway, you're never going to get that 210. And it ended up, we'll have this video out either right before or right after our podcast goes live. So, what should have been about a 15-hour drive and 3 hours of charging ended up taking me a lot more. But what made this interesting, is that on the way up here, Volvo had just gotten access to the Tesla supercharger network.
Mhm.
So I decided to make it a Tesla powered road trip. And that worked out pretty smoothly, except for the car does not know where Tesla stations are right now. So
Mhm.
if I plug in the route, it said, hey, here's where you need to stop. But the problem was I couldn't tell it to stop at any Tesla stations. So what I did is I kind of side loaded my Tesla app, and I was matching the stopping destinations, because this car also doesn't have a visible preconditioning or a manual preconditioning. So what I just tried to do is match what it wanted me to do to make sure the trip was as smooth as
Yeah.
possible. And the only hiccup was that one time I was looking through the Tesla superchargers and I was in the wrong spot on the app. So I was looking at all the superchargers, not the adapter enabled superchargers. So luckily, I made one stop that was not going to work, but I had just enough range to get to the next one. Because it turns out these things tend to be just about everywhere on your major highways. So overall, it went fairly smoothly on paper, but functionally, it was it was a bit of a trip.
Yeah, so let me for the viewers and listeners out there, let's go down on these points one by one just so they're informed. So, preconditioning is needed because EVs need to have their battery at a particular temperature for maximum fast charging. However,
Mhm.
interestingly, Volvo doesn't bother to precondition the battery because basically it's automatic. It always is going to keep it in that range, and it doesn't
Window.
charge terribly quickly. So, so the
No, it
slower your
doesn't.
battery charges, the less it needs to precondition. I mean, it wasn't bad. We would hit about 210 kilowatts, I think, maximum on some EVgo stations. What did you see?
So the max I saw was 151,
Ooh,
and the superchargers I was stopping at, most of them were 250 stations. So
uh,
so they again, the kilowatt rating was higher than what I ended up getting, and I will say that it really ramped down the charging speeds.
yes.
At 50%, we are no longer anywhere near 150. You're probably just below 100. And there were a couple stops I
Mm,
made that were a little bit longer. EV charging folks know that the more you fill up, the slower it gets. I was around 75, 80% at about 39 to 42 kilowatts. It was crawling, but it did end up saving me one less stop while I was grabbing a bite. So it ended up working
yep.
out okay.
And this brings me along to the routing, and sort of the logic, I think, behind GM's decision to not do CarPlay, which I still think is stupid, but this the rationale. They want the data. So they
Mhm.
want to know if you're using their routing mechanism, even if you DC fast charge somewhere off of their map system, they at least know where you went and how long it took you to get there and how much energy it took you to get there, et cetera, so they can try and improve the routing, which is basically what Tesla has done. And part of why Tesla never did CarPlay because they want all that data too.
Right.
Um, I have discovered that for road tripping, really in anything that's not a Tesla, but actually it works really well with Teslas too, is the a better route planner, ARBP.
Mhm.
That works really well. You can get it on your smartphone. It does work with CarPlay, so you can actually CarPlay or Android Auto a better route planner, although the interface is terrible on
Well,
CarPlay,
and it's
mind you.
it's installed here on this Volvo as well.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
but again, the interface is clunky.
You might want to try that on your road trip down back here. And
So
then
on
the
the
final
way back, I'm gonna let the car go ahead and just
ah,
plan the route because I'm not gonna be using the superchargers. I did that on the way up.
yep.
On the way back, I'll just go ahead and let the car do its thing.
Yeah, so far, nobody that implements Google Automotive, which is what Volvo uses for the infotainment system, they're
Mhm,
same as GM and a bunch of other companies. So far, nobody that uses Google Automotive has actually put in the Tesla supercharging stations, which is weird and interesting. And Ford, which does their own thing, and they were the first to the supercharger party, they still don't recommend Tesla superchargers in their route planning. At least they didn't when we drove the Lightning only about two
mhm,
months ago in November. So I think that's a really weird thing, especially for Ford having been so aggressive at that. And I think that it's also a problem because it does leave customers in your situation where you went to a Tesla supercharger station that's not compatible.
mhm.
That requires another
W
explanation for everybody.
Yep.
Not every Tesla supercharger station can charge non-Teslas, and that's because Tesla initially used a proprietary standard for the communication for DC fast charging. It was based off of CHAdeMO, sort of loosely, the
Mhm,
older Japanese standard that was used for the Nissan Leaf initially in the US, but very changed. So, and different connector, et cetera. Just the way that they talked was similar to CHAdeMO. Then Tesla decided that they should just follow everybody else. And so they started using power line signaling, which is what CCS uses. So, really, every Tesla sold in the last few years, which is about 90% of all Teslas ever sold, their connector is Tesla's connector, the NACS connector, so called. But behind that, it speaks J1772 and the ISO standard for CCS. I know, guys, the
ye
nitpickers are going to be like, no, it's not called CCS communications. For
Correct.
simplicity's sake here, it's easier than the ISO standard that it's
So
based on. Any rate,
so
so
pulling into these
all you,
Tesla stations,
yeah,
what's different about them is that there is no physical interface, except
hmm
for the new version Force. But that was mostly not what I was dealing with.
yeah,
So it was, version 3 is most likely, and all you do is pull up to them and plug in. So it's app based. So you have to be able to tell this station, hey, click the app. I'm
yep,
at this spot. Off you go. And what
yep,
I will say is that so I'm a Tesla owner. For folks who don't know, so I pull my Tesla up, I plug it in, everything starts. It communicates through to the car, which is connected to my credit card. It's plug and play, right? That's what
hmm
people are going for. Plug and charge, excuse me. But for this, I had to go into the app, but it was really easy. And one of the big bonuses here is that every station I stopped at worked. And
Yeah.
for folks who have spent time at DC fast charge stations in the electric vehicle, it is not uncommon for more than one, or at least one of those stations, to be down or rebooting or having an issue. And that is one of the big benefits of these superchargers, that you don't really run into that. And the first one I stopped at was a 42 bay charging stop.
Hmm.
It was a brand new, big, shiny one. Solar panels above it. Even had pull through chargers, so there were a couple spots
Ooh.
for folks who were towing with their Teslas to be able to pull through. But what was funny is when I was there, it was just me and this Volvo and a Rivian who pulled up. So uh, that's one of the other benefits, is that Tesla has really big banks of charging stations,
Yep.
and that way you're not going to end up waiting in line.
I mean, logically, they need them because there are more Teslas per Tesla plug in the US than non-Teslas per CCS plug. So,
Mhm.
relative, density there. They need the bigger stations because there are more
Yep.
Teslas out there. But let's move on to our non-specific EV news, which is the
Mhm.
shocking headline that Honda and Nissan are merging. It's okay, you can tell me, you can rake me over the coals here because I said it wasn't going to happen.
I honestly didn't think it would happen either. I mean, we had the conversation. What does this look like? And we were talking about Nissan. Nissan needs some help, and who's going to jump in, and what do they get out of it? And that was kind of the problem, is that there wasn't a very clear, obvious. Here's what you get if you come
Hmm.
in, join Nissan, and support them moving forward. But Honda's usually pretty conservative in how they operate their business.
Yeah.
So for them to make this move really does feel like they see a point, they see a reason, they see a benefit for themselves. I love to see more cars on the road, so and more
Yeah.
variety of cars on the road. And if the options were Nissan integrates with somebody else or Nissan goes away forever, I'd like to see the integration.
Now let's dive into the details for folks that don't know. So basically, Nissan and Honda have announced publicly that by 2026, they will form a holding company and they will transfer both companies into the umbrella of that holding company. This may or may not end up including Mitsubishi. It will probably tangentially at least involve Mitsubishi because Nissan currently owns around 20% of Mitsubishi or so, although we're not entirely clear what Nissan is going to be doing with their shares of Mitsubishi and how they might fit
Mhm.
into this puzzle. But we probably ought to describe Honda and Nissan globally for folks because I don't think a lot of folks understand this one. And it was actually kind of funny because I hadn't really thought of it in this exact way until I was speaking to someone very randomly at Hyundai in South Korea, and the conversation had wandered around and a whole bunch of journalists were saying, "Well, why doesn't Honda do X, Y, and Z?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's kind of weird. Like that seems like Honda should do whatever." And the Hyundai person, not having a horse in this race, obviously, because it's not their company, basically said, well, in Honda's defense, you have to understand they're a much smaller car company than most Americans think of. And that is certainly true. When you look at Honda, they're actually you might actually even describe Honda as a North American company, as a actually very US centric American company that happens to have a Japanese ownership structure because the vast majority of Hondas are built in the United States, designed in the United States, and sold in the United States, which is really weird and interesting. Um,
Mhm.
did you ever think of Honda that way?
No, and honestly, in very different terms, I think it's a regional thing, because I grew
Mhm.
up in the Pacific Northwest, and I always thought, not being a big traveler, that Alaska Airlines was a big time airline, and we've had this conversation because that's what I saw all the time. That's their branding,
Mhm.
that's their advertisement, because they're a hub here in Seattle. And turns out they are not one of the bigger airlines, and they're my second or third choice at this point when we have to go out and go places. It's the same thing for Honda. I always thought,
Yeah.
oh yeah, Honda's a big company. Obviously, they're involved in motorsport, so they have good visibility. They've got a lot of models here in the U.S. Between Honda and Acura, they do well. But it's one of those things to find out that globally they're not on the cutting edge was shocking, because that's what I
Mhm.
see every day. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
there's personal bias there, but the bias is just, oh yeah, there's a Honda, there's a Honda, there's a Honda, they must do well.
Mhm. And it is kind of an interesting, so we should pick these numbers apart yet further, I guess, for folks out there. So, um, it does strike me as interesting. You know this. Every time we go to a Honda event, Honda is extraordinarily proud that they build almost everything they sell in the US in the US. They have a huge
Hmm.
facility in Ohio, a huge technical facility there as well, big design center in California as well. They're super, super proud of designing and manufacturing and engineering and marketing everything that they do in the US practically in the US. Is very little really
Hmm.
that comes from Japan. In the US in 2023, Honda sold about 1.3 million cars. Sorry, in North America, I should say. That is the biggest market for them currently. China is technically number two, but there's a big asterisk here because Honda sold 4 million cars globally, 1.3 million approximately in North America, 1.2 million in China. But every car sold in China is sold through a joint venture that Honda owns about half of. So really,
Yeah.
Honda's only responsible for about 600,000 of those vehicles there in China. So that really puts this in perspective. In Europe, Honda is actually a fairly small brand. Nissan sold about 5 times the number of cars in Europe versus Nissan. So in the US, Nissan is a little bit smaller. In Europe, they're significantly larger. In the Middle East, they're significantly larger, also due to their sales, their model blend.
Right.
And when we take a look at, for instance, Australia, Nissan is number 12 in that market. Honda is number 20 in that market.
Yeah.
So pretty big difference in terms of these model spreads, but also the vehicle lineup looks very different when we look at everything globally. So Honda has never had, or I should say, never, not never, but they do not make currently any light or heavy commercial vehicles, no buses or
Mhm.
heavy equipment. They don't make any body on frame truck things or SUV things like Nissan does. They do make K cars, and they have some Chinese specific models that are part of that joint venture in China. But by and large, if you buy a Honda here, there, or wherever, you're buying almost the same Honda. The only time a Honda has ever been sold with a V8 engine was the Honda Crossroad, which actually used a Rover V8 engine. Nissan, on the other hand, looks like a miniaturized version of Toyota in a way in their lineup. They do buses, they do the trucklets, they do the trucks in North America, they do Europe trucks, they do tiny trucks for Japan. They're kind of all over the map. And I think that is part of why Nissan's profits have been lower and why they've been stumbling because they've been this wannabe Toyota without the volume that Toyota has to help spread that cost structure on. So when we look at this merger here, in North American terms, it certainly looks like a merger of unequals. It looks like Honda is
Mhm.
rescuing Nissan, but it does in an odd sort of way. As long as Nissan can fix whatever financial issues they may have in the short term, as long as that can be repaired by 2026, there are certain synergies as far as the market penetration. This would give the conjoined company a decent presence, not huge, but decent presence in Europe. It also would give them that presence in the Middle East, the body on frame platforms to function in some countries like Australia, et cetera, in the Middle East where they prefer body on frame vehicles. You know, I would love to see, for instance, a Honda truck built on a Nissan Frontier frame. Like, there's nothing wrong with the
Mhm.
Frontier frame, but how cool would that
Right.
be if you could get Honda engines and all that in a actual body on frame truck? I think that would be all kinds of fantastic. Um,
I
but
mean,
that's
even
sort
even
of
in the utility space,
Mhm,
Honda builds a minivan. They don't build a utility van. They don't build a cargo van.
exactly.
Those are and when you're looking at ways to increase sales, fleet is a great way to do that. Commercial is a great way to do that. So
Mhm. And
yeah, it'd
both
be
of
an
these
interesting add-in.
manufacturers have been struggling a little bit in China. They've seen sales drops in China for a while. The joint ventures are kind of problematic for companies like Honda and Nissan. It is also possible that this conjoined entity could allow them to free themselves from those joint ventures, maybe let one go and buy out the other. So that way,
Mhm.
probably the Honda joint venture is probably the one you want to take over, I guess, in China. But, they could just sell the other half of the Nissan one to the Chinese company, maybe buy a majority share at least in the Honda one. So that way they would actually control this.
But Honda hasn't been afraid of partnerships, especially in the last
Yeah.
couple of years, right?
Mhm.
So we've
Mhm.
seen recently a very successful partnership with General Motors for the Honda Prologue. We have the Honda Sony venture for their upcoming electric vehicle, and it's in the past we've also seen joint ventures. You know, I've talked about before. I owned a Honda Passport, which is not a Honda. That was an Isuzu
Mhm.
Rodeo. But again, we find these joint ventures and so far they've done pretty well. So I would trust their math on this one, and I'm really just curious to see what a merged Honda Nissan vehicle ends up looking like. Like you said, a Honda powered
Yeah.
Frontier of sorts. What does a heavier duty cargo vehicle look like? I
Mhm.
would say Honda's got their Civic Type R, but if we're tapping into some Nissan IP, then they also have a Nissan Z over there. That'd be pretty interesting to see in
Yeah.
uh, a potential revival of an S2000. I mean, there are things I can dream of.
There are some synergies when it comes to platforms there, and we should say that, of course, Nissan and Honda are gonna stay as separate brands. That's what they said. They're
Mhm,
gonna exist as separate brands, but they will most likely start sharing parts and components and things like that. And that kind of brings us along to our wish list here, which we should say, like, what should they kill and what should they keep or transition?
mhm.
I'm gonna go out and say that I think Nissan should just kill off the majority of their engines.
Okay. Think they're just too
That's
many,
that's
or
my
or
thought.
they're not making
I
a
think they're
big enough
just they're
impact.
just too many somehow.
Okay.
Nissan's also had some troubles with their variable compression turbo. It's a little funky. I don't find anything wrong with it. It has been a little funky. There have been some complaints about problems. I don't know whether they're real or not, but it just
Mhm.
doesn't seem. Why does it exist when we also have the Honda 2-liter turbo that's just nicer?
Right.
I think that we should keep the Nissan 3.8-liter V6 that's in the Frontier. I think that's a fantastic engine, and the Nissan twin turbo V6s, those are fantastic as well. Those should hang on a while. Nissan's VR engines have always had a nice sound to them. On the Honda side, I am curious to see what they decide to do as far as synergies here. Because on the Honda side, there's not a lot that I would want to kill off, other than I think that Honda needs to get some plugins. So obviously,
Mhm.
Nissan has the battery tech, and history there with plug-in hybrids and EVs that Honda does not directly have, because Honda's
Mhm.
up till now only produced EVs in either very small numbers or primarily through joint ventures, et cetera. So that could be kind of a cool thing. But I would love to see, some rear wheel drive Hondas. That could be kind of cool. Rear wheel drive Acuras.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that's the big thing we're missing. There is some Honda refinement that could, especially in powertrains, that could work its way into the Nissan lineup. But
Mhm.
really, Honda's missing body on frame and rear wheel drive architecture. I don't know if they need it, but I think it is missing. So if they
Yeah.
wanted to try something, if they wanted the next generation Ridgeline to be a body on frame, there's an option. You use the nameplate, but obviously you make a different kind of vehicle. Um, I would love to see a rear wheel drive sports car option, but I'm not anticipating it. It's something though that you could say, hey, if we want to work, one of the Acura sedans in to a rear wheel drive layout and be competitive with something like the Genesis lineup that has some rear
Mhm.
wheel drive options, that would be something that I'd be interested in, and definitely some more plug-in options because right now the only plug-in hybrid Honda on the market is the fuel cell vehicle, and that's obviously going to be in very, 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 very limited numbers. And
Right.
it's a test mule for consumers. So having something, anything in the lineup wouldn't hurt.
Yeah. I could see a world where we could take a Infinity rear-wheel drive platform and Infinity's twin turbo engines and Hondaify the driving dynamics, etc., and give us a more practical, maybe they jam a torque vectoring axle in the back. Honda loves torque vectoring axles. They could do something along those lines. Because I do think that Acura is in a bit of a pickle. Acura is not a global luxury brand. They're not sold in every
Mhm.
market. Considerably smaller portfolio than Lexus. Again, very North American focus to Acura, which is a problem given the size of that brand. I think that
Mhm.
they could easily ditch Infinity. Sorry, Infinity dealers. You could ditch Infinity, focus the resources on Acura, and try and merge those platforms in there. I mean, it would be really cool if TLX next time was a rear-wheel drive vehicle,
Mhm.
fewer people are buying sedans. The people that are buying sedans are expecting higher performance, sportier vehicles, and they don't have anything along those lines. Nissan also had a rear-wheel drive hybrid system that was really quite efficient that they could just resurrect. Um, that kind of also makes me wonder, though, what is the future for Acura and Infiniti in this global
Mhm.
conglomerate? Are they really trying to compete with Genesis? Because I would say if they are trying to compete with the rise of these really well-funded small divisions like Genesis, that's going to be a problem. I don't see going forward in the product lineups that I've seen so far. I don't see
Mhm.
anything that is going to be overly competitive in in competing against Genesis, which is trying to be more of a BMW and Mercedes competitor than an
Yeah.
Acura and Lexus competitor. And I do think it is interesting when you talk to the Genesis people and tangentially BMW and Mercedes PR people. BMW, Mercedes, Audi, Volvo to a lesser extent, they are not concerned about Acura at all, or to a decent extent Lexus as well. They don't see those as competitive brands that are being benchmarked by their true core customer set, but they are worried about Genesis.
Yeah, I don't know if they need to be competitive, but it would be a a feather in their cap to be able to get something closer. And I think what we do find, not to say Genesis is the most expensive of the brands, but we do find Infinities and Acuras as some of the more affordable
Mhm.
entries into the luxury lineup. So if they became ever so slightly less affordable, but had a premium, right? They could still be the entry in the performance luxury brand without having to be all the way, right? Without having to have all the
Mhm.
customizations and all the individual pieces and all the fine touches. You could still get a good quality product. Um, I think the big thing I'm curious about is what's the big benefit to Nissan, because they have been in a holding pattern. They have been trying to hold on, and they haven't had a lot of
Yeah.
cash flow. And I'm not assuming that Honda is just going to start dumping cash into Nissan for Nissan's sake. That's not what I see happening. But they're not going to be in a full survival mode, hopefully here in the near future. So, what does Nissan look like today when they're not in this survival mode? I think that's
Yeah.
probably just going to be good for everyone.
I'm gonna guess that Nissan's gonna look a little bit more like Nissan used to look because, honestly, a decent percentage of what's kinda gone crazy, hinky at Nissan has to do with the Mitsubishi alliance.
Mhm.
The necessity that they buy 25% of Mitsubishi, that was orchestrated effectively by the Japanese government, just like this marriage appears to be orchestrated, at least some string pulling behind the scenes by the
Encouraged.
Japanese government. Yeah, encouraged, we'll call it that.
Mhm.
Um that logically put a big financial strain on Nissan, and that's part of, I think, why we are where we are. Will it have that same effect on Honda? We just don't know. I will say that for the commenters on our Facebook when we were posting about this earlier, um, there's this big, huge set of Honda fans that are like, Honda's not a car company, Honda's an engine company, and they just happen to build some cars. I do need to be clear on this one. Honda is a car company that happens to make a few engines on the side, because three-quarters of their revenue comes from cars. They are the largest engine maker in the world. Yes, they make generators, they make motorcycles, they make ATVs and side by sides and marine engines and all
Mhm.
kinds of other stuff. But that entire portfolio, motorcycles, engines, that whole thing is about a quarter of their revenue globally, and it doesn't tend to center on some of their other markets. So that is a good thing for them because it's stable business. But it's
Mhm.
also worth noting that that is a low margin business for Honda. So about a quarter of their revenue, but much less than a quarter of their margin comes from everything else they do. So they're primarily a car company, and they function really differently in a way. So like the marine side does the marine side, and the engine side that's kind of like all separate, and there's not a lot of crossover. Like you don't, the PR people, the sales people, marketing, etc., they're not
Yeah.
talking Honda Civic one moment and then how do we sell a generator, guys? And
The
so
closest you'll
there's
get is the Moto
yeah,
Compacto, right?
right. Hmm. and
Now,
that's
yeah,
not even made by Honda. That's made by someone else and then sold by Honda.
we're not here to worry
Designed,
about
I believe, by Honda.
that. So,
Uh,
Alex, we've talked about what we were looking for
mhm.
in something like this merger, but it's come up before, and we're here in 2025. What are some of the things we are not looking for in new vehicles? Um,
Oh,
you know,
burn it with fire.
it's a new age, and there's every model year we start seeing trends going different directions. What are the
Mhm.
things you're not looking forward to for 2025 models that should never, ever, ever show up on a new vehicle again, if we could help it?
I mean, I gotta go with the first and easiest one is shiny black plastic. I mean, that has
Hmm.
no place on a car, inside, outside, no shiny black plastic. Just, just burn that thing.
Have you
Um,
ever mentioned that before? Has that ever come up?
I think maybe once or twice. Yeah, discreetly.
Right, right.
I don't know what's your top one?
Well, it's going to be a little bit on the nose here, but it turns out my top one is buttons that don't do anything. And for folks who don't
Oh.
know, in a lot of cars, if you get a lower level trim, where normally you would see a button bank and there's a couple of different slots, but some of them are empty. That used to be one of my pet peeves because then I can tell I'm not getting a product. There's an option that comes with this vehicle.
Mhm.
Obviously, I didn't pay for it, but I would like to pretend like it's not there. But on this Volvo, it's got a button right there on the steering wheel, just to the left of it, that is indicating a adaptive cruise control system. Right, it's got your lines up and lines down.
Mhm.
But when I went on this very, very, very long road trip, and I went to turn on my adaptive cruise control, it's not there. And
Nope.
boy, let me tell you, that is a frustrating situation when you really want adaptive cruise and it says you have it, but you don't.
Yeah, and Volvo even includes all the hardware necessary for it because you can enable it yourself with a third-party software widget where you can go in and turn
Mhm.
things on, so,
You told
yeah,
me you
that's
did a little
definitely
bit
a
of digging
bummer.
into that.
Yeah, I think we're gonna do it. We're gonna give it a whirl, see how it goes. It's a used car, so, hey, how wrong can it go?
Mhm.
We'll give it a whirl and, report back and let everybody know how that goes.
And just to make sure, we decided to do that after I took the car,
Yeah,
not before.
yeah.
Awesome. Great. I'll bring
I,
it back without adaptive cruise control, and then you can add adaptive cruise control so that I can
yeah,
never use it.
we'll see how it goes. I'm gonna go with car enthusiasts who never buy new cars and yet complain about how new cars should be. Um,
Mhm.
this is a recurring theme, and I will just say the comment section is a fun place. It is full of
Oh,
com and
Wild West.
but let me say I got two sides to this thing. I agree with the commenter, but commenters they're also not thinking about how this works. So it's like half of America can't afford this car. What are these car companies crazy doing? No wonder so and so is blah 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 blah, right? Usually it's like
Mhm.
Stellantis or Nissan or whatever. Stellantis has been the punching bag lately. No wonder Stellantis
Mhm.
is going bankrupt. Blah blah blah, because half of America can't afford this thing. Well, newsflash: half of America ain't buying a new car. The 330 million Americans and about 13 million, maybe 12 million, perhaps, buy a new car every year.
Mhm.
About
Mhm.
14 to 15 million new cars are sold depending on the year in the US, but remember that's all fleet cars, people buying multiple cars. So depending on the measure we're looking at, it could be as low as 10 million Americans actually are buying
Right,
new
consumer
cars a year,
vehicles.
right?
Mhm.
Consumer vehicles, because that consumer may have actually bought more than one, which is why that number
And
is
that
probably
and
skewing
that
down a bit.
demographic gets tighter and tighter and
Yeah.
tighter every year on who it is, not just how many, but who specifically it is buying
Yep.
that vehicle. And I'll put my hand up. So I leased one but bought two. So technically I've purchased three new vehicles so far. And I'm the outlier. So when I go
Yeah.
to a manufacturer and I go, "Where's the car for me?" They're not going to build a car for me because I'm not the one who's going to buy the majority of them. That's as much as I
Right.
want it to happen. I mentioned a Honda S2000. You know how that would sell? Not terribly well.
No.
Enthusiasts would love it, but and I would be one who considers to go buy it. But the problem is, my demographic does not buy new vehicles.
And it is
Yeah.
interesting. There is still a core demographic, ostensibly middle class, perhaps most likely upper middle class, that's buying mainstream brands. So your Chevys, your Toyotas, etc. There's a solid demographic that does this. Even the wealthy will buy regular mainstream brand cars. But because of this ever narrowing focus and the fact that these people were always relatively wealthy, there are more and more models available targeting them. And what I find interesting, and this is an interesting twist, way to think of this, is if this shopper actually wanted a Nissan Versa or similar, right? There would be them in the market. We would have
Mhm.
them. But when you look at what's happened across the lineup, manufacturers don't sell the base trim in huge volume anymore. It actually it's been decades and decades and decades since that was the case. But I mean,
Mhm.
in our lifetime, base trims do not sell. Um, Mid-level trims are not normally the bulk of the volume. It actually skews towards the higher end trims in a lot of vehicles. And
Mhm.
and that's why manufacturers have looked at that and said, "Hey, let's have a $100,000 pickup truck. Let's have a $100,000 SUV because this person can't afford it." And that's clearly what they want. They aren't rolling to the dealer and buying base Ram tradesmans. They're buying the bonkers thing with the stupid passenger screen. Stupid passenger screens need to die. Can add that to list. Um, Right, they're
Tacked on.
doing that stuff, which is why we have Denali. We have the top end
Mhm.
ones in the Ram lineup, and the top end ones in the Ford
Right,
lineup,
your
etcetera.
tungstens, your high
Mhm,
countries, your 1974 editions. Yep.
mhm, and why we see record sales for BMW and Mercedes and record profits for Stellantis. This is one of those things where, I do kind of laugh at this a bit because Stellantis has been in the news a lot for being kind of, blind to American desire. So, they killed the
Mhm.
V8. The European president was like, the Hemi needs to die, kind of dissing the North American market. That's the claim. But their profits are still quite high. Well, it remains to
Mhm.
be seen exactly how 2024 shaped up for Stellantis, but they had record profits and record margins in 2023. Stellantis has the second largest cash pile in the auto industry hanging out there. They have something like 10 times the cash that Tesla has on hand.
Mhm.
So lots and lots of money, and it seems like their board and their president at some point made a decision to say, we don't care as much about sales volume. We care about these high margin, crazy things. And we're just going to
Mhm.
jam more passenger screens, stick more leather on the dashboard, and just ratchet that price
So
tag
the
as
margins
high
are.
as we possibly can. And
Yep.
only when dealers started squawking, saying, hey, we need the volume to still function,
Yep.
and the union, et cetera, is going like, "Hey, like, I know you are having high margin cars, but this workforce was designed to build X number of hundreds of thousands of things, and we're not building
Right.
that many. So, layoffs, et cetera." It's all very complicated there for them. But, bottom line, people are buying expensive stuff.
Yeah, I mean, even just to add to that, I mean, it's the opposite direction. Excuse me. But of of the 3 vehicles that I purchased, 2 of them were the base model, which means
Mhm.
even though I bought the most affordable model and I said, "Hey, I'm here. I'm in the minority and I made them the least money they could on that particular model." So again, it's one of those things that it's just there's not a great way into it. I will say one other thing that I think I mentioned this earlier when we did this last time. Big wheels do not need to become the norm. They really, really, really don't. And I had the Silverado EV RST in my driveway the other day, and that had 24-inch wheels. And what was really gross to me is that it didn't seem like it. Right, the vehicle itself is just so big, and the wheel well is so large. It just seemed like that was the size of the vehicle.
Bigger is always
Hope
better.
24-inch wheels, at least a 50 series tire. I mean, obviously they get thinner, but and they get thicker, but there's enough tire on there that I'm not like, oh my gosh, this is absurd. But that's absurd in and of itself because it's a 24-inch wheel. That's a lot of wheel and
It's a
then
lot of
not
wheel.
a lot of tire. And then I hope I get to use this. I had a great opportunity when I had that truck and when I was filming it to pair it up with 2 of my grandfather's Chevrolet trucks. Hopefully, I get to pull that one together. We'll see how the final edits come through. But both of those trucks have it was I believe a 15 and a 16-inch wheel.
Yeah.
So oh boy, is that just a very different concept all the way around.
Yeah, so much less expensive to mount a 15-inch wheel, you know? Uh,
And I'll tell you what, the tires on that silver what so small tangent, my truck's a 2500, therefore I have to get 2500 rated tires, which are generally more expensive than you find in a half ton truck. Um, those tires, and I got five because I replaced the spare. That was like $1,100. Um,
mhm,
and that's with a 16-inch wheel. You
yeah.
start shopping for the tires for that Silverado EV. I admit I haven't done it, but I'm scared to because that is not going to be an inexpensive set of tires.
Not gonna be cheap, and you're gonna run through them really quick because that thing
Yeah.
weighs almost 9,000
Yeah, and you're
pounds.
probably gonna keep putting your foot in it because it's real
'Cause it's
fast,
fun.
and it's not gonna feel like you're shredding those tires because 'cause you're not gonna hear them.
Yep, yep,
Yeah.
indeed,
Yep.
indeed, indeed. Would you go I am torn. I don't know whether black wheels are worse than big wheels. Um, but I detest this
Hmm.
whole black wheel trend. They always look dirty and dusty.
Okay.
They just visually give the car this big black hole, and then it's
Okay.
funny that car companies are like, "Well, um, I don't know." They're like, "We need to visually relieve some of the weight on this," so they give you these huge black fender arches, lots of black cladding, a black tire, and then this black wheel in there, and you're just like, "What am I supposed to think that there's this, like, sliver of car floating above this black sea?"
That's
I don't know,
exactly
it's
what you're supposed to
weird.
think, yeah. I if I
Not
could get
working for
rid of
me.
one in an instant, I think I would get rid of the trend to bigger wheels than for black wheels. I'll admit I'm a big fan of a dark gray wheel, so there is
Dark gray
still
wheels are okay. They're okay.
so I'm more okay with that black wheel, but I get what you're saying.
Mhm.
It's trending, right? Because once we go that direction, once we go bigger, 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 we're not going to come back because visually they don't look as good, but functionally, man, it's a different world.
Yeah. And of course, cars are getting ever heavier, so
Yep,
all the tires are getting bigger, the wheels are getting
that's
bigger.
that Silverado is not light.
Spare tire changes are also gonna be a back throwing out kind of event here. Those
Impossible.
those
You have to
those
call
big
AAA,
stuff,
otherwise
yeah.
you're going to the hospital.
Those things are heavy. That is not an easy thing to lift and move around.
No, no.
Let's move on to our solicitation for reviews and comments and voicemail questions, etc. So if you are on Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star review if you can, and of course, descriptions are always better. So leave a written review over there. You can also review
Let
us
us
over
know
at
what we're doing,
Podbean.
what you like, and
Yeah.
we went to go grab some of those today, and we just wish there were more.
Yes, and, we're getting 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts, but not a lot of comments there, so, you can also
Hmm.
send us your voice memos, you can just record them on your smartphone, make sure it's a quiet place close to the phone there, and then you can email us at hey@autobuyersguide.com. You can also, do the 1990s thing and, leave us a voicemail. You can call
Hmm.
669-842-1947. Again, that's 669-842-1947. Follow the fun voice prompts and drop us a note there. And that reminds me, going back to segueing back inelegantly
Hmm.
to the Acura Nissan thing. In
Yeah.
my in my mind, the problem I think with Acura, Nissan, Infinity, Acura, and
Acura.
Lexus
Yeah.
in this build,
Okay.
this strikes me as a 1990s General Motors tableau. So,
Okay.
I see Infinity as the Oldsmobile
Okay.
and Acura as the Buick and
Hmm.
Lexus as the Cadillac of this trio. And
Okay.
all three of those are somehow still not co-equal with the Europeans in terms of what the customer is actually interested, the luxury customer, quote unquote. So if we take a
Hmm.
look at this demographic of who is buying a Mercedes, the European set, a Mercedes
Hmm.
plus Genesis, Mercedes, BMW, Audi, Volvo, and Genesis. Those five in that segment. Even though Genesis is the smallest of them, I'm including them here because of what they're making.
And
Um,
Volvo's a little different as well, but yeah, I get
Volvo's
what
a
you're saying.
tiny bit different, but the customer that's buying, and this is the key thing, is when you
Yeah.
look at customer research, third party like cross shop data that's out there, and you talk to these luxury manufacturers, talk to the PR people at a launch for a Mercedes, Audi, etc. What do you see as the competition for this vehicle? What are you looking at in the industry as far as trends and that sort of thing? This group of five will refer to the others, including Genesis,
Hmm.
which is why they're in this group. So you'll talk to Mercedes, and there's a C class launch or something. C class, they were definitely commenting on Genesis and their electrification direction, etc.
Hmm.
Um, when you talk to them about Lexus, they're like, well, the Lexus shopper is different. They already want a Lexus, which I think is by and large true. This
Yeah.
customer, they want reliability, they want a Lexus. They may have said, I considered a something, but they didn't seriously consider it. I don't know very many Lexus shoppers that bought an RX and actually cross-shopped an X5. Like
And
I
they
don't know
probably came
anybody
from
that
their
did that.
Toyota counterpart. Yeah.
Could be, or they just stepped right into the Lexus family somehow. Whatever, however they ended up there,
Mhm.
they aren't really branching off. And the Lexus is in a way this different island because it's very well protected. The walls are high.
Mhm.
The reputation is strong. The allegiance is also strong, right? That brand's
Mhm.
core Lexus shopper. And so like when Lexus does a stumble like TX that wasn't on sale for 9 months doesn't seem to be a problem. They recall all the engines in the Lexus LX, not a problem. Because they also consider that as like, well, Lexus took care of me.
Mhm.
Even though they would also have said if this had happened in a Volvo, they would have said, "Oh well, that Lexus or that Volvo they recalled every engine. I'm never getting one again." Um,
Yep.
it's that kind of customer. But then when you look at Acura and Infinity, they're like tiers below that. Less loyal customers, less premium offerings, smaller lineups, more
Mhm.
heavily skewed towards singular models sales volume wise. Um, QX60 occupies some ginormous percentage of Infinity sales.
Yeah,
Um,
MDX.
yeah, MDX and
Mhm.
RDX to combined are well more than half of all of Acura sales. It's a huge, huge volume of sales in just those two
Yep.
models. But I think also, like you've been in a lot of these interior fit and finish materials choices, I would say.
Mhm.
How do you describe that to someone out there that's maybe considering these?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a much broader conversation that we keep disagreeing on, and that's okay. I would consider that's the world we live in. I would consider your Infinities, your Acuras, and somewhat your Lexus, your Lexi, on
Lexi.
the premium end of things versus
That's
the
that's
luxury
exactly.
end of things.
Yeah.
And I'm all for it. I'm
Mhm.
all for it because I would generally consider myself a premium shopper if I was going to pick something over a luxury shopper,
Mhm.
because I'm not really willing to pay more for that extra degree, right? I don't need 9/10; I need 7/10. If your mainstream car is 5/10, or around 5/10, right? There's otherwise why would you bother buying it? I'm fine with that 7. I don't need that 8,
Mhm.
9, 10. Not that the 8, 9, 10 aren't nice, but obviously you end up paying quite a bit more for those extra tenths. So I would fall into the premium shopper. Of those, I'd probably jump in an Acura, something like a TLX. Again, it's just what model would fit what I'm looking for.
Mhm.
Actually, I'd hop in an Integra, but that's kind of a different thing in and of itself. But yeah, it's a different market. But they are competing against
Yes.
themselves, and in that market, Lexus
Yeah.
is definitely the most luxury of that premium segment, I think.
Yeah. And I agree with the premium designation, but I think that the premium designation is getting harder and harder to defend because
Yeah.
what is interesting is that in the US market specifically, over the last maybe 30 years or so, we've seen a significant reduction in premium as far as
Mhm.
branding and volume in the US.
Yeah. Yeah.
Relatively small increase in mainstream, lower overall volume, mind you, given
Mhm.
America's size. It's a bigger country than ever before. We're selling about the same number of cars as we were quite some time ago, so kind of weird pooling and a big, big growth in the luxury segment. So, and I think it's an ever harder position to try and be in that middle ground. We used to see those brands that I mentioned earlier that don't exist anymore, Oldsmobile and Buick, as being those two different levels of premium. Uh,
Mhm.
Largely, the Chrysler brand was thought of as a premium brand over Dodge. For instance, Dodge is the
Mhm.
mainstream. Chrysler was a premium. Chrysler's all but dead. We had Mercury. Mercury is dead. And now Lincoln is
Right,
whatever
Lincoln. Yep.
whatever it is that Lincoln is, right?
Lincoln's still
Premium,
there.
I don't know. It's whatever we call it, right?
Yeah.
And it is interesting that we see this shrinking of these middle brands.
Mhm.
And truly the biggest one that is left in that middle ground, I would say, is Acura. That very firmly slotted in the middle.
I mean,
Buick is
if I
obviously still
may,
there.
even on the GM side, it's not just the middle ones, right? We're also missing Pontiac entirely. We're
Mhm.
also missing Saturn entirely. That was in
Yep.
that group. So what you see, like you said, we still see Buick, we still see Cadillac, but
Mhm.
the premium luxury shifts. We also see GMC, but they compete separately than Buick.
Yeah.
They're kind of a different segment, but I think in the same level of what they're trying to
Mhm.
achieve versus the Chevrolet alternative. But yeah, sorry. So, but to Acura.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. Like I just wonder what, and let us know, commenters, especially if you are an Acura owner or you've recently purchased an Acura, sound off in the comments, in the reviews, leave us a voicemail, etc. How do you perceive Acura, and where do they need to go to get your attention? We're going to be seeing a new Acura soon, the ADX, and
Mhm.
I am not as jazzed about the ADX now as I was initially. I think it's gonna be well priced. I think it's going to
Mhm.
sell well, but I don't know if I'm excited about the ADX. I had hoped that it would be a bit more different, because initially there were some incorrect specifications that Acura had sent us that implied it would be on a unique wheelbase with some sort of unique dimensions. Not not actually. It's really just going to be, an Acura Honda.
Yeah, which again, a lot of those options are. I think one thing that is missing, and I don't think we'll see it change, not with this merger, not in the long term, is that there's no next step. So if you are in the Honda family, your first car was a Civic, and then you went with an Accord, and then you got an MDX, right? You'd made the leap to the Acura lineup. There is no next leap, and that is something that I think like General Motors has done pretty well. You got your Chevrolet, your GMC or Buick, and then you have your
Mhm,
Cadillac. Even Ford, right, where you could go Ford, then you could go Mercury, then you could go Lincoln, if that's how you wanted to scale it. There is no next level Acura,
mhm.
and that can be said about a lot of other manufacturers. But I think of something a little more obscure. If you go Volkswagen, then you go Audi.
Yep,
The premium option is a Porsche in that brandscape, but
yep.
it's not a
And then you
connected
get to go
model, right?
Bentley.
Yeah, I mean, it's the scale of things. So Honda doesn't have that next scale.
Yeah.
So are they comfortable saying we're going to lock in this premium product, um, or are they going to say, hey, here's a model that's right on the edge of premium and luxury, and while that could be an absolute home run, it could also be a big strikeout. So yeah, that'll be I'm curious, and I don't think we're going to see
Mhm,
huge change based on this merger unless we see one of those brands like Infiniti. Maybe if Infiniti goes away, then I could see a larger stretch for Acura because Lexus obviously has $100,000 models, and then they've got the UX. So
yep,
they're trying to bring a lot of these things in. The ADX is basically a response to the UX, in my
yes,
mind. Right? It's the least expensive entry level option that has some
mhm,
premium touches, some premium feels, um, versus your HRV.
yeah,
So yeah, I don't know. I'm curious to see where it goes. I think there's opportunity, but I don't think Acura is in a position to go, bam. Here we are. We're a luxury brand, and we're competitive with the mainstream German European luxury
mhm.
competitors plus Genesis.
Yeah, I'm eager to see how that functions for them. I mean, ADX is logically a response to UX, and more more in a way a response to Volvo's XC40.
Mhm.
Um, the interesting thing that I think we've seen in this luxury segment has been MDX has had this position as the family premium luxury three-row thing,
Mhm.
with a usable but not overly comfortable third row. It's like a good, solid Goldilocks, just right kind of third row for many
Mhm.
families. Um, but Volvo, with their absolutely ancient XC90, which just got another refresh and may win the award for the oldest car on sale in America in a decade, because I bet it's still going to be on sale. It had its best sales year in North America and best sales year globally last year, as old as it was, which is exactly why they were like, let's just stick a new grill on it.
If it ain't
Bigger
broke.
screen, new grill, call it good.
Yeah.
Um, but it is interesting. Volvo has clawed up the sales charts, and they're number 2 in that luxury 3-row segment there in
Yeah,
sales in North America, with a transaction
which is
price
one of the
that's
hottest segments.
significantly higher.
Yeah.
But they're getting a lot more money out of their customer than Acura is. So there's money in them, there hills. And in the small SUV segment, the subcompact, XC40 is the bestseller in North America, and the second bestseller is Cadillac, oddly enough. And so it is. I'm intrigued to see how ADX does in that market, but I could see that with the conjoined volume of Honda and Nissan together, it's going to obviously take a decade at least for platform sharing to really start creeping in here. But I
Yeah.
could see a world where it may make more sense if you ditched Infinity. This could give Acura the funding and the freedom to say, you know what, we're going to use that same Honda platform, but we're going to tweak it in some important ways, which is what we haven't seen so far. So maybe instead of a McPherson suspension, we take that Honda platform, we jam a multi-link suspension on it, a double wishbone suspension, more like the Volvo lineup.
Mhm.
We widen the track, we stretch the wheelbase or shrink the wheelbase or whatever. If you have the money, you can do that. But we do see that, Honda being a very conservative, very fiscally conservative company where they're like, no,
Mhm.
there's no decision at Honda to be like, let's lose money on Acura. Acura has to make money. And that's, I think, why we see those decisions that way. And
Yeah.
also why we see the decisions at Genesis, because Genesis just burns cash. I mean, there's no money making on that one. That is just throwing the cash on the fire. And the only decision for Hyundai every year seems to be, how many more billions would you like to burn on the fire that
Mhm.
is Genesis? But it does kind of show in the product.
Well, and we're getting some of those Magma models over in the Genesis lineup, and that's again more cash, but it'll also gain market share and attention.
Yeah.
I will say one of the things that Volvo has going for it is pretty competitive powertrain options, including hybrids and plug-in hybrids that we're not seeing over on the Acura side of things. So,
Yes. And it is worth noting that I think is responsible for Volvo's sales success, especially in XC90. A shocking number of them are sold as plug-in hybrids. In the US, depending on the year, it's been almost 50% as plug-in hybrid in some states. California has been the leading market for that. It's been between 60 and 70% plug-in hybrid volume
mhm,
in XC90. It's a huge volume. In Europe, you see the Volvo XC60 plug-in hybrids, especially everywhere. They're doing
yep,
extremely well in the plug-in hybrid systems. And Volvo has been really aggressive at, even though they haven't changed the XC90 itself, they've made significant changes over its course since 2016 on the
yeah,
drivetrain. So we've had, 3 different batteries, 2 different engines, a bunch of different electric motors, different transmission jammed in there, substantial changes to that plug-in hybrid system, to the point where when it launched, a lot of folks were like, hey, the 400 horsepower is fun. The range, it sucks. To now, the range is like, you can get about 40 miles of electric range out of an XC90, and you get 27 miles per gallon and 455 horsepower, which absolutely blows away an MDX Type S
more,
Series
more,
60.
more.
Right.
Yeah,
And is more efficient than any version of the MDX ever has been. So, it is an interesting twist there that I'm
mhm.
surprised Acura has not joined on, because Acura did have a hybrid MDX that I thought was fantastic.
Hopefully, it's in the works.
Yeah. Any rate, everybody, let us know in the comment section, in those reviews, voicemails, voice memos, etc. Send us all those, and wish everybody a happy and merry 2025.
Bye, everyone.
If you're looking for a new or used car to buy, maybe a truck or SUV or all-electric ride, we're the guys to help you decide. Here on the Auto Buyer's Guide, if discussions about donuts in the parking lot is what you came here looking for, well then my friend you're lost. Because our very human host Alex, we swear he's not a boss. Does he respect the cars a lot? He does perhaps too much, yes probably, but he'll help you